Welcome everybody to the second meeting of 2014 of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Remember and switch off your mobile phones, mobile devices can interfere with the sound system. That means all of us. Thank you. Agenda item 1 is a decision on taking business in private. First item is to decide whether to take the item 4, the draft report on proposed draft Agricultural Holdings Scotland Act 2003 Remedial Order 2014 in private. Is the committee agreed to do so? Agreed. We are agreed. Thank you very much. And therefore we will move on to that's in order to approach the scrutiny of the Common Agriculture Policy in private as well. Okay. We're agreed. So agenda item 2 is subordinate legislation, and members should note that no motions to annul have been received, but we have several orders to take, and I ask you to have a look at the papers just now so that we can raise any points from these that there may be. There's a whole list of these, and I think the best thing we can do is just to look at that set of papers just now and see if anyone has any points that we need to make in each of the. Yep. So the first item is on environmental protection restriction of use of lead shot. Any comments on that? Yeah, Graham Day.
If I may, Convener, thank you. As the local member for Angus South, I very much welcome the measures that are being implemented at Barryburn. I do note the concerns that have been expressed by NTS, and I look forward to making a site visit in the next few weeks to actually see for myself the measures that have been put in place and how they'll operate. But certainly welcome this that's before us today.
Okay, that's great. So no further comments on that one. The next one's on plant health amendment order. Any comments on that one? The next one is on the agency arrangements in the Scotland Act. Any comments on that one? No? Okay. The next one is the Seafish Prohibited Methods of Fishing in the Firth of Clyde Order 2014. Any comments on that? I can only raise one comment. It says in the order that it applies to British fishing boats, but it doesn't apply to any other nation's fishing boats. And I can't remember what the answer to this is, because this comes up regularly over the years. Could we just find out by writing to the CAB Sec about this? Because the order restricts during certain months certain species being caught, except for trawling for prawns and things like that. And it would be useful to know why, because fishery officers of either the Scottish Fishery Protection Squadron or the Royal Navy can stop people in these waters during that time. That's the only point I would make. No other points there. We have Environmental Protection Duty of Care Scotland regulations. No issue being raised. Yes?
I'd just like to highlight, from my perspective, the importance of this as a regulation in view of the fact that it relates to the transfer of waste and how important it is that there is a proper paper and computer trail in view of the risks of environmental crime, which can be very serious. So I just want to highlight that point.
Excellent, thank you. The next one is the Common Agriculture Policy Schemes Cross-Compliance Amendment Regulations. Any comments? Yeah. Yes, Jim Hume.
Of the papers that there wasn't any consultation with stakeholders because it's a transfer from a statutory management requirement to a GAIC requirement. I would have thought that there would have been some consultation, and it would be interesting how the government will communicate that this may affect GAIC conditions, therefore cap payments, I suppose, if there's any protection of groundwater against pollution incident.
So we'll just write to the Cabinet Secretary and ask.
I think that would be worthwhile.
Yes.
If
Not at
so
all.
minded.
That seems fine. We're all agreed. The next one's on Less Favoured Areas Support Scheme Scotland, amendment regulations. Angus MacDonald.
Yes, Convener. Thank you. Certainly welcome this SSI, which simplifies the procedure for rollout of less favoured area support in 2014. And I look forward to and hope that a similar procedure can be implemented in 2015, pending advice from Europe. This SSI will give some comfort to rural farmers and crofters at the current time.
Thank you very much for those remarks. No others on that one. The next SSI is on long leases, appeal period, Scotland order. No comments on that. And then we have long leases, prescribed form of notices, etc., Scotland regulations, which is also got no need to draw any attention to it. In that case, the committee is content to make no comments other than those on these regulations. Are we agreed? Yes. Thank you very much. Okay, we move on to agenda item 3, the draft third National Planning Framework in PF3 evidence session. For our third item today, committee will take evidence from stakeholders on the draft in PF3, and we'll ask the witnesses to identify themselves in a minute, and we will kick off the round table. Should note that the microphones are organised by the sound system. You don't have to press anything. You indicate to me if you want to speak, and then we will try and let the discussion flow. So starting with the first person's our MSP for Dunfermline. Can you identify yourself, please? Yeah. And the next person?
Mr Hutchinson from Scottish Natural Heritage.
Thank you.
Claudia Beamish, South Scotland and Shadow Minister for Environment and Climate Change.
Paula Charson from the Scottish Environment Protection Agency.
Richard Lyle, MSP, Central Region.
Alistair Brown, I'm Head of Sustainability at Glasgow City Council.
Michael Dawn, MSP, Angus North and Mearns.
Bruce Wilson, Scottish Wildlife Trust and Scottish Environment Link.
Alex Ferguson, MSP for Galloway and West Dumfries.
Aidan Smith, Head of Planning for RSPB Scotland, but today representing Scottish Environment Link.
Jim Hume, MSP for South Scotland.
Angus MacDonald, MSP for Falkirk East.
Fergus Murray, Argyll and Bute Council.
Graham Day, MSP for Angus South.
And Rob Gibson, MSP for Caithness, Sutherland and Ross. I'll kick off the first theme that we'd like to cover and ask you to consider what extent the goals of securing a low-carbon Scotland is embedded across NPF3. So what extent are the goals of securing a low-carbon Scotland embedded across NPF3? Who wants to kick off? Right, Peter.
Hi, yeah, I would kick off by saying positively I think NPF is helping support the goals of a low-carbon economy. It covers matters to do with climate change mitigation in terms of preventing impacts, but also it talks about climate change adaptation as well. And specific things related to there is about getting the right development in the right place in terms of mitigation, but also in terms of adaptation. It talks about the importance of green infrastructure, creating a resilient environment.
Thank you. Anybody, you don't all have to answer it, by the way, but the point is we've got a chance. Paula?
Yeah, I think SEPA would recognise that the National Planning Framework has got a fundamental role in delivering against Scotland's greenhouse gas reduction targets. And I think actually it translates that rather well in spatial planning terms about how to mitigate carbon, particularly in the energy sector, I think that's very, very strong. There are areas, I think, where we can possibly do more, and we can maybe explore that later, maybe on issues around carbon, around waste, management issues, zero waste, and patterns of low carbon developments as well.
Okay, well, we'll try to do so. Aidan.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I should say there are a range of different views within Scottish Environment Link about how effective the National Planning Framework is on this issue. But I think we're all in agreement that there are some really positive words in here about how we can deliver some things through adaptation and some things through mitigation. But perhaps where it's maybe a bit lacking is in terms of some more precise actions which actually could be taken over the next sort of 20 to 30 years, but even a bit sooner than that. I mean, it's always worth bearing in mind that this framework's looking forward 20 to 30 years, so it's really long-term things. I think also some members are concerned that there are maybe some contradictions in it, and perhaps that's inevitable with the nature of a document like this, in that it has very positive words about some things which can be done in terms of adaptation, very positive words on the benefits of renewable energy, but it also does include, of course, some developments which will result in increases in carbon emissions if they go ahead as it stands. So some contradictions in there which maybe are not fully addressed. Another thing which has been picked up by some Link members as well is that if we're moving forward with current technology, then in order to reduce our carbon emissions, we're going to have to do some transition away from existing sectors, and it doesn't really tackle that issue maybe as effectively as it might. So, for instance, oil and gas and fossil fuel combustion it could be compatible with carbon reductions if CCS comes on stream, but if it doesn't come on stream, then we're going to need to think about how we deal with that.
Context of CCS, yes. Bruce, and then.
Yes, just particularly with regard to peatlands. Again, this is a Scottish Environment Link view that I'm putting forward. Some members have put forward to me that the MPF3 is good and that it talks about peatlands, but it does say specifically relevant to North and North West Scotland. There's a lot of peatlands in these areas, but there's also a lot the borders and the Central Belt as well, rolling Willies bog restoration, that also have a lot of community benefits, and that's been identified as being a huge potential carbon store. So it might be good to get the MPF3 thinking out with just the terms of the North and North West for peatland restoration projects. Also, this might be more for SPP, but it might be worth tackling horticultural extraction of peatlands. Because that's something that in England is still allowed. Is effectively banned, but it's still allowed technically up here. So that might be something for us to look at.
England's got very little peat left to extract, but it's a fair point, and you know, we can see peat extraction still going on in some areas in the north, in my constituency, and so on. But thank you for that, Fergus from Argyll.
Yes, thanks very much, Convener. Basically, from Argyll and Butte's perspective, I think the draft is a welcome improvement from the main issues report in terms of it. I think our concerns still a wee bit under recognition of the role maybe the West Coast and a collection of authorities there could play in actually contributing to the generation of offshore renewables in terms of coordinated areas. We don't see that really been recognised in the new draft, but we welcome in terms of the recognition of the pump storage and hydro, and that's an important thing for Argyll and Bute with Crook, and I realise it's national development is for hydroelectric over 50 megawatts. It might not necessarily be there. In terms of, we also welcome the better recognition of active travel routes. There is a concern maybe how do we actually maintain the routes that we have and also start to maintain the new routes that are coming on stream, which we all wish come forward, but there is large concerns there about we properly maintaining them for all large sections of the people that use them, and maybe a little bit more recognition in terms of the forestry, in terms of Argyll and Bute, 30% of its land mass is forestry, and I think that can play a really more important role across maybe Scotland in terms of tackling the carbon issue. That was really it.
Very good. You know, securing the low carbon Scotland, you know, how much is embedded in this report, because obviously we have to make our own comments as a committee on this. So Alistair next. Yes, hello.
Thank you, Convener, Committee. I think maybe if I just restrict the comments to a general overview of NPF 3 just now, I'm assuming there'll be opportunity for greater discussion in terms of the development priorities, particularly in relation to how they affect the Glasgow area, which there is a fairly strong feeling in the west of Scotland that it maybe hasn't picked up on that. In terms of the document itself, I think as a narrative on where Scotland is today and where Scotland is going tomorrow, it's good and it covers a lot of the bases. There are, however, as colleague Aidan said, quite a number of issues where it's not clear on actions in actual fact over the next 20 to 30 years. And reading the document, we did feel that there are a number of areas that don't seem to have any great prominence within the document. The issue of waste, which is a big issue for local authorities. In Glasgow, we have a new waste treatment plant, and indeed other local authorities have quite a strong focus on waste management in the coming years. There's very little in there about future cities, which is, again, a big issue for Glasgow. As you know, we are the Future Cities Demonstrator City for the UK, and we are working closely with a number of the other Scottish cities in terms of being able to roll out some of the benefits from future cities to other cities in Scotland. There doesn't seem to be any kind of acknowledgement of what the benefits of that might be in the coming 20 to 30 years. There's very little about resilience. There is some, if you look at, for example, the Glasgow Drainage Plan, it is very much focused on resilience and climate resilience in the coming years, but that's only one aspect of resilience and climate resilience over the next 20, 30 years. Glasgow has recently been awarded status of the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Global Resilient Cities. It's a new network that Rockefeller Foundation have recently created, and Glasgow had the accolade of being given the invite to the network with the first 33 cities just in December last year. And resilience and climate resilience in Glasgow will be very much a key focus in the coming years as we work with Rockefeller and with the other network cities across the world. And that climate resilience won't just be about drainage and water, it will be about transport, it will be about communications infrastructure, it will be about sustainable buildings. And I think resilience is going to be, and resilience planning is going to be an important part of what any city is going to be doing in the coming years. And Glasgow, hopefully, will be at the forefront of that. And the other two areas which, for me anyway, were lacking within the document were to do with partnerships. Again, in a city the size of Glasgow, partnership arrangements are really important. The Metropolitan Glasgow Strategic Drainage Plan, MGSDP, which is referred to in NPF 3, is built on partnerships, but there's various other examples, good examples of what's happening in Glasgow and indeed in other cities, and indeed the Scottish Cities Alliance itself is a partnership arrangement, which doesn't really seem to be picked up on the benefit of what working in partnership will be. And the last issue, which doesn't seem to be included very much, is urban air quality, which is obviously a big issue in all of the cities in Scotland and indeed elsewhere. Air quality is going to be a big issue in terms of the development of public health issues and economy in the coming years.
Can I just come back to you just a moment, because I raised a motion in Parliament praising Copenhagen for taking up the crown as European Green Capital for this year. And I posed the question about the government and COSLA and local authorities thinking about what would need to be done for any Scottish city to compete in that competition to be the green capital. So, you know, in relation to the remarks that you've made in the Rockefeller, 100 cities and so on, how do they relate to, a European city like Freiburg or Nantes or indeed Copenhagen?
Look at the Rockefeller Foundation's network, which is an international network. There are, at the moment, there are only 33 cities. The intention will be to build up to 100. There are only, out of those 33, there's only 5 in Europe. If I can remember, there's Vegela in Denmark, Glasgow, Bristol, Rotterdam, and another one which has escaped my mind, but it will come back before the end of the morning. Anyway, there's a very small select number of cities, so Glasgow is very much in that kind of select group of international cities. In terms of the Green Capital, as you may know, Glasgow actually bid for the title, for the 2015 title, and the adjudication process took place in 2013. We were shortlisted into the last 4, along with Ljubljana, Bristol, Glasgow obviously, and the 4th was Brussels. The panel, I mean, this is anecdotal and to a certain extent. I obviously was part of the presentation that we gave to the EC, but we reckon we came second. Bristol did get the title for 2015. Glasgow's bid was very much based on the partnership arrangements I spoke about, which were a key part for the EC, and the aspect of green growth, as it was termed, which was very much about how can the environment lead to economic growth, how do you get jobs from green growth. And we did make a strong pitch in relation to the opportunities there for being able to assist economic development and green growth. The feedback we got from the panel was that Glasgow's bid was strong and they were happy with it. They just felt that we had not maybe demonstrated that we had done enough up to now. We gave a good description and a presentation on where we were going and what we wanted from Glasgow as a sustainable city, but they felt we had to provide a wee bit more evidence of what we've done, and we have got some aspirations to go back again and bid for the title, potentially maybe in 2018. And if we do that, then we have to maybe build on some of the lessons we learned during the process in the last year or two.
Your evidence is very welcome, because we were less than happy with the evidence from COSLA, which didn't seem to wish to engage fully with this process just now. And it's good to hear from our leading city just exactly some of the detail of that. And clearly, many of our members have interests in cities as well as the countryside, and it's worth knowing. So has anyone got any points that they want to raise in this short section just now before we move on to some other themes? Alec Ferguson.
I wonder if I could perhaps ask Mr Brown, who has mentioned the lack of focus on the importance of partnerships in this, if he could just very briefly expand on the sort of partnerships he's referring to and their importance in this whole process.
A good example would be the Sustainable Glasgow programme. I think in Glasgow, the administration has, before the last election, the administration proposed manifesto commitments, 100 commitments, and the second largest grouping of commitments was to do with sustainability. And the council leader was quoted after the election as saying that in order to deliver the commitments, as politicians, you know, you make promises during elections, you have to try and keep them afterwards. So in order to deliver the commitments, the City Council would not be able to deliver a lot of the sustainability commitments on their own, and partnership working would be very important. And the Sustainable Glasgow programme, which has now been running for the last 3 years, has been really quite a key part of where Glasgow's going in relation to sustainability, because it creates a network of public and private organisations. So we are very active in Glasgow with the NHS, for example. Scottish Government are represented. The academic sector is represented. And there are a number of private sector organisations as well. So the partnership arrangement is very much about us working together. And if you look at the drainage plan, for example, that's clearly a partnership arrangement involving SEPA, Glasgow City Council, other local authorities, and Scottish Water. If you look at some of the work that we're doing just now in relation to trying to develop energy networks in Glasgow, it's very much about us working with the large energy companies. It's about us working with the NHS and with other maybe public sector organisations who may wish to contribute to a district heating network. If you look at housing in Glasgow, it's all social housing is now outside of the council. It's with the housing associations, and therefore we really do have to work in partnership with a number of other organisations if we're going to be able to deliver some of the things that we want to deliver.
I think that's very useful, because it just highlights that where appropriate, we're not just talking about public sector partnerships, we're also talking about involving private sector and others in this process. So I find that very illuminating. Thank you.
Very helpful. Aidan and then Graham Day. Yeah.
I think this is a really interesting discussion, because what this is highlighting is that the National Planning Framework is kind of the spatial expression of government policy, and some of these issues are kind of more related to sort of governance structures, if you like, and perhaps the National Planning Framework doesn't make those connections quite as well as it could sometimes. And I wonder if there's maybe more the National Planning Framework could do to make those connections between what some bits of government are doing in terms of governance structures and what we want Scotland to look like, whether that's towns and cities or urban areas. And in terms of how we could maybe make some of Scotland's cities more like some of these fantastic European cities, I think what the National Planning Framework is quite good at is thinking about what we can do in terms of new building new stuff. It's maybe less good at thinking about how we can maybe restructure our existing built development. Some of Scotland's cities are doing some really good work on this, but I don't think that the National Planning Framework really kind of highlights how things can change. So, for instance, an obvious example might be the move to more sustainable transport. How do we make our existing built environment fit with cycling and walking and so on? The National Planning Framework picks up on things like new national walking and cycling networks, which is great, but it's really more about recreational walking and cycling rather than the sort of walking and cycling that gets you to work and gets you to the shops and so on. And I think the framework could maybe do a bit more on that sort of stuff about how we can restructure our existing infrastructure.
Okay, Graham Day.
Thank you. My question is perhaps Alistair Brown. It's quite, from the sounds of it, Glasgow City Council is extremely proactive in pursuing partnerships, which is very welcome. But without wishing to put you on the spot, is that typical of local authorities around Scotland?
If I broaden that a wee bit, we have a lot of dialogue with other cities, and it is becoming more typical of what cities are doing. I recently had a discussion with a colleague in Copenhagen who regularly get put up as being the vanguard of the green agenda, and they were asking us about partnership arrangements and how they could develop that more. So I think for all cities, if they really expect to develop infrastructure, make themselves more resilient, become more sustainable, then they definitely have to look at partnerships, and that does seem to be an emerging trend throughout cities elsewhere, not just in the UK but abroad as well.
But across 32 local authorities in Scotland of different size and shapes, are we seeing these sort of practices taking place, or is there a movement towards these partnerships being developed?
I can only really speak about cities, and we've had, again, if I give you the example of the dialogue we've had through the Scottish Cities Alliance, that there is clearly an emerging debate about how cities can work in cooperation between themselves, but with other partners. And if you take, for example, I don't know, what we're doing in relation to drainage, Scottish Water, are obviously they work throughout Scotland and throughout all of Scottish cities. So I definitely feel that the trend amongst cities in Scotland is to work more greatly in partnership.
Talk about partnership at this point. I think, Claudia, is it on partnership?
It's more about embedding
right,
infrastructure.
Well, we actually can come on to that in a second. We've got Fergus, first of all, and then Paula, and then we'll take Claudia. All right?
Yes, I'm sort of speaking from a very much a rural council perspective, a remote rural council perspective. We work in partnership with the likes of CEPA and SNH. Our resources are extremely limited, though, I think, compared to the city. So they're quite informal, and what we actually concentrate on is avoidance of risk. So when we build in our plans, we try and avoid the flood areas, we try and avoid vulnerable areas. I don't think councils in the rural areas are committed or have the necessary resources to do proactive work, such as cities, and working in partnership. I think that's a general perspective from my experience working in the North Highlands and working with my colleagues in planning and economic development. And interestingly, actually, is a lot of local communities are showing the way forward and working in partnerships. to challenge the carbon agenda, like, for example, GIA and their 4 wind turbines, and their latest turbine, which is based on, you know, battery power, innovative. It's them that are driving it forward. They're supported by the likes of HIE and the council, but increasingly it's through in-kind support or professional support rather than, you know, having significant resources. I just wanted to make that point.
Very good. Well, Paula and then Alistair can come back on this point. Yep. Paula?
Yes, Convener, I just wanted to give an example really of where there are other local authority areas who are engaged in partnership, and a good example is the development of the Tay plan up in the Tayside area. In fact, they won an award, I think, from the RTPI for the partnership working on the development of that plan. And also SEPA's experience with local authorities in developing the flood risk hazard maps has been fantastic as well. So I think there are pockets and examples of it across the country.
Come back from Alistair Brown just now.
Just maybe just another example. To talk about Scottish cities, there's been a lot of discussion between the Cities Alliance about sustainable transport and alternative fuels. Aberdeen has a particular focus on hydrogen, and there's been quite a lot of discussion between cities and some of the bus operators, for example. And I could see that being an emerging opportunity as well. Can I also just say that the 5th city, European city in Rockefeller is Rome. I have remembered.
Useful, thanks for that. Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to everybody. Looking at this question of the goal of securing low-carbon Scotland and it being embedded across MPF3, there are a number of points that have been touched on this morning, and one of them particularly I wanted to highlight was what Aidan Smith had said about the infrastructure that already exists. And I also don't see much in MPF3 about how we can shift that into a more low-carbon way of living. For instance, with active travel is a typical example, but also district heating issues. And I don't think there's a great deal of information about low-carbon heat. Also, not a great deal perhaps about waste, which I think was highlighted by SEPA. And I'm wondering if we could sort of hone in a little bit more to what kind of actions we should see more within threading through the whole document. Obviously, that's a very big question, but people can...
This in terms of low-carbon place?
Possibly, Convener, yes, if that's more appropriate, yeah.
We could certainly park that a little, because there's... and, you know, you can rejig the question again by leading off in low-carbon place, all right, in a minute or two? Just because we need to think about... how well NPF3 supports the delivery of RPP2. Let's talk in acronyms. The RPP2, which is our particular concern in this committee, generally looks at the policies to deliver that low-carbon economy that we've just been talking a bit about. So it might set up a discussion very soon about the low-carbon place, which Claudia wanted to raise just now. Is that okay? Right, so the first person's Bruce Wilson.
Very quickly, again, with the peatlands issue, I know I said it before, but I think it's...
Slightly later on,
okay,
in
that's
fact,
fine, if we can come in then.
Well, we'll come in at that point, yeah. It's a theme which we've identified we'd like to deal with. So next on... how does the support the RPP2? Aidan Smith.
This is it's something which is a bit challenging for Link to answer, to be honest, because we did have a discussion about this within Link the other day, but Link's views on climate change are sometimes a little bit light, because most Link members who have a real active involvement in climate change issues tend to work through Stop Climate Chaos or work as their individual organisations. So our focus has really tended to be on some of the issues around adaptation and mitigation, but we've not looked in detail, I'm afraid, at the exact match-up with RPP2. So there's a few things we can kind of touch on, but we probably don't have a very detailed comment as Link, unfortunately, on this.
Stop Climate Chaos seemed relatively happy with the way in which the NPF3 was laid out in that respect.
Yeah, so the
Would
one...
Link agree?
Broadly, I think, although with a disclaimer of the things I touched on earlier on when I was talking. Right. And the other thing I think which should come up was about timescales as well. So the timescales don't seem to quite match up. And the NPF is a really useful document in terms of it looking far ahead and looking at this 20 to 30 year time horizon, whereas some of the other measures which I think have been brought forward through RPP were maybe not quite looking as far ahead as that. So the two could maybe match up a little bit better and maybe look more to the NPF time horizon. That would be useful.
So we've got Peter first and then Paula.
Okay. Yeah, in terms of the links with RPP2, I just think it's important to highlight that NPF3 is seeing the natural heritage as an asset, and so we're not trying to make our challenges any worse. And I think that that's something that we should be encouraged. You know, that the natural environment is seen as an asset rather than a constraint. And the other thing I just want to mention in terms of specific actions, you know, that came up earlier, there is a national development in there to do with national and cycling network, and that is about helping active travel to people's work, where they live, work, and where they visit as well. So there are practical actions within the NPF in terms of the national developments, as well as other developments supporting a low-carbon economy.
Paula, Nigel, Don.
Okay, there's so much you can say, isn't there? So I'm trying to pick on one thing which I think fits with your agenda here. So I think it focuses quite a lot on energy supply considerations generally and very well, but I think there is more, I think, that could be done on actions around promoting sustainable patterns of development, new development, existing development. And I think perhaps one of the ways of doing that is to encourage, as an action, more use of kind of carbon assessment tools to think about the carbon impacts of those developments. So we already have a tool. The Scottish Government have developed a tool with SEPA and others, the Spatial Planning Assessment and Climate Emissions Tool, SPACE, which in fact I noticed was used in the strategic environmental assessments for the national developments. They actually applied the SPACE tool, which was an interesting way of using it because it tends to be used for a bigger development, so it can be applied to national developments. So I think NPF could actually go further and suggest that for all developments that carbon assessment is conducted. So you do have an understanding, and SPACE allows, I think, for kind of optioneering, options appraisal, for siting of housing, for industrial developments, etc. And I don't think NPF is strong enough in that.
Nigel, Don.
Thank you, Convener. I'd just like to go back to what Peter Hutchinson was just saying about National Cycle Network. And I think it's also been referred to a little bit earlier that what appears to be in here is more about leisure than getting to work, if I can use that phrase. That may be the right way around, but I just feel that perhaps we should do more towards making sure that we can get to work. I'm very conscious that as a rural constituency member, I have places that are roughly 10 miles apart. You ought to be able to cycle between them to get from one to the other to go to work, and by and large you can't without taking your life into your hands on relatively busy but minor roads. Now, ignoring that as a detail, do members around the table, do our witnesses feel that MP3 says enough about cycling or active travel around rural areas?
A simple answer to that, or a more complex one? We had Aidan Smith and then Fergus Murray. Can you address that as well, please?
Yeah, in terms of Nigel's immediate question there, I'd say no is the answer, and it could do more, certainly. I think what's quite interesting here, though, as well, is we're kind of straying to some extent into what the SPP covers rather than the NPF. So the NPF is kind of the spatial vision, if you like, and the SPP is kind of the criteria-based policy, and it's really hard to tease the two apart. And I think it's really useful, though, that government are actually consulting on both at the same time at the moment. So there is a statutory requirement for the National Planning Framework to have its parliamentary scrutiny period, but there isn't particularly for the SPP, and I think that's been perhaps a bit of a weakness. So it's good that we're actually able to kind of touch on these issues during this period. Just going back to Paula's point on the sort of carbon assessment, if you like, of development, one of the things which some Link members had raised through Stop Climate Chaos' submission, I think, on the RPP, was that perhaps the SPP, in terms of the criteria-based policy that it requires. One of the things that the SPP could maybe usefully require is when major developments are being considered by local authorities, there should be a specific requirement to consider the carbon impacts of that and how that is going to help us meet our carbon reduction targets. And also when local authorities are preparing their development plans, that there could be a specific requirement for local authorities to specifically consider how that development plan is going to help us meet our carbon reduction targets. And I think that could really help focus our minds, focus local authorities, but focus everybody's, focus all the partners who are working on these things' minds on how we're going to reach these targets. But I think that probably is something which probably fits a bit better with SPP rather than the National Planning Framework, albeit that it's hard to tease the two apart.
Fergus Murray.
Yes, just from Argyll and Butte's perspective, and we welcome any investment in terms of active travel routes. I'll say that from Sustrans, and we work very closely with them. We work in partnership with them to achieve that. But the concern I have in terms of these aspirational things of active travel, which are great, we're totally signed up to, and what we do in terms of a rural area is we try and prioritise routes that will serve multifunctions. They're not just recreational. They'll come into the town, for example, from Dumbarton into Helensburgh as a new cycle route. We want a safe route right into the town that will help with people going commuting, but also join up to the John Muir Way in terms of a walker's route and stuff. The problem that we do have, though, is that, again, it's coming back to actions that will maintain that. And just to give you an example, our core path plan in Argyll and Bute has got well over 1,000 miles of active travel routes, and the budget for maintenance is £7,000. So our struggle is we welcome that investment. We will always say yes, but we're always struggling, and we say, can we have something to maintain it to the standard that we need to? And the answer is always no. You need a new project. So if we're going to have these targets, and we need to think the whole holistic picture in terms of it, and make sure that when people use these routes, they don't phone me up and complain about how bad the route is, and which happens quite often.
Yeah, understood. Alistair Brown?
Yeah, there's quite a strong feeling in the west of Scotland that the NPF3 has failed to pick up on the need to use and utilise vacant and derelict land, former industrial land. I think 43% of the total vacant, derelict industrial land in Scotland lies within the Glasgow-Clyde Valley area. And we really feel that there has to be a greater focus in terms of the setting of development priorities in the future. The use of industrial land is certainly covered in the discussion about Ravenscraig, but the strategic development plan for the Clyde Valley area looks at the corridor running from Inverclyde all the way down through the Glasgow city centre area and then down into the Lanarkshires. So we do seem to be missing what is a primary focus for Scotland's regeneration. And there is quite a strong feeling in the west of Scotland that should be given greater prominence in NPF3.
Okay, we've got three at the moment, Bruce, then Peter and then Dick Lyle. Yes, so Bruce Wilson first.
Nigel's point, is that all right? Yep. Yeah, it was actually raised at the link planning meeting we had on Friday by one of our members that actually says specifically on rural areas be more accessible, which is section 5.23. Reliance on the car will remain important in rural Scotland, and there's no mention of active travel in that section, and that was something that was highlighted as being a bit problematic, especially as Nigel says, there's plenty of towns in rural Scotland that are 10 miles and below that could easily be cyclable. So that was something that was raised, that was asked to bring up today.
Bear it in mind, yes, for sure. And the next one's Peter Hutchinson.
The original question about the National Cycle Network, whether it was actually going to provide in rural areas, particularly for local people. I think the focus of the national development is to provide connections, so it isn't going to be able to provide access for everywhere, and it is designed to provide these key strategic connections. But as has been mentioned in the discussion, active travel is not just through the national development by itself, and we have to think about core path plans as well. And this is the challenge for the national planning framework, what goes in the national planning framework and what is progressed at local development plans. And also what is sort of progressed by other initiatives as well. And there was a comment there about funding, and that's where the National Planning Framework has got to connect with other initiatives as well. So really I'm saying I agree with the question. You know, it is a challenge, but it probably isn't going to be the National Planning Framework that provides all the solutions to that. And if I can just quickly pick up on another question, you know, the focus on derelict land. There is also the Central Scotland Green Network national development as well, and that within the proposed MPF is providing a focus on reusing existing land that has been used, but also is encouraging a focus on active travel as well, which might not help in terms of some rural areas, but it is providing a steer for that national development.
We've got a point on this just now.
Yes, basically, Convener, thank you. Can I echo the comments made by Alistair Brown, in particular in regards to Ravenscraig, and compliment the Scottish Government in finally making it a national priority, something which the previous Scottish Executive never done at all during the years it was in, and it was something which was continually thrown at me as the SNP group leader in the Council, and the Government's now done that. But can I also say that in the document, I would suggest that Glasgow and Clyde Valley should have separate pages, and Edinburgh and South East, because they are diverse areas. Glasgow on its own has made a lot of improvements, but people within the South and North Lanarkshire area would say that we within want to improve, and we have a lot of areas which are derelict and we want to increase. And lastly, I think one of the things that I've always said is that sometimes we have too many planning restrictions which actually make people don't want to invest, and we don't encourage investors to come in. Too many things, and it all boils down to what's good for the area and what's good for the local community. I could go on and on. I see that you're getting a bit impatient with me, Convener, so I will close in regards to that.
It's very useful to have these comments in there. Claudia Beamish is going to kick off in the next section, which is very appropriate, about low carbon place.
There's quite a robust chapter, I think, in the National Planning Framework 3 in this draft ambition opportunity in place. And obviously place is fundamental because it's where we all live, work and try to relax sometimes. So in terms of actual actions, as I was just highlighting previously about the present built infrastructure, which seems something that we're always grappling with, about how we can actually adapt our cities, our villages, and indeed our rural areas, so that we can effect change. It's much harder, for instance, of course, to state the obvious, to put in new district to adapt district heating into old buildings in the same way that it's harder to have segregated cycle lanes on roads that exist already because they weren't built in that way. And I'm just wondering, in those terms, what comments anybody has, if that's helpful.
Yep, that's excellent. Aidan Smith is going to kick off.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I think it's perhaps a bit of a weakness of the document still. I mean, the National Planning Framework is still really evolving as a document, if you like. So this is the third one we've done, and it's only the second one which has been statutory, and it's come from a planning background. So it's really focused on things which the planning system has an influence over. So the planning system, as opposed to, say, for instance, building control or roads authorities and so on. But I think what would make the National Planning Framework more useful is if it takes a more holistic approach and looks more holistically at these different things, these different sectors which influence the places that we live. And it does that on some issues, but it kind of only touches on it, really. I think what would be more useful is if this was a better, more comprehensive, more complete, if you like, visualisation of what sort of Scotland we want to see, looking at these other sectors as well as just the things which the planning system can influence. And I think it's the Minister's introduction, actually, where he says that this is the this is the kind of spatial expression of the government's economic strategy, and it kind of is, and it kind of starts heading down that route in some areas, but it doesn't quite touch on it quite as much as it maybe could, where it's not things which are directly influenced by the planning system, such as some of the things which Claudia mentioned, which are maybe more influenced by building control or by roads authorities and their planning mechanisms. And I think this probably could be the place where we could bring these things together and actually have a more holistic look at the sort of Scotland we want to see in a few years.
Scotland we want to see. Other comments on that? Alec Ferguson?
If I could refer to Mr Smith's comments just now, because I noticed, two of the areas in which the Scottish Government and others are very keen to develop are aquaculture and wind farms, both of which carry a certain amount of controversy with them, as all of us who get representations on these issues are all too well aware. And I noticed in the submission that Environment Link are very strong on, and quite critical of, the lack of focus within NP3 on both of these areas of development. I just wondered if you could expand on your concerns on that a little bit, and perhaps say where you think that NP3 is lacking in this regard, NPF3.
Sure, yes, happy to. So I think on the wind farm issue, for instance, and this kind of touches on some of the stuff which comes out in SPP rather than the National Planning Framework as well. On the wind farm issue, for instance, there is a recognition in SPP that it recognises the value of wild land, and I think that's potentially a bit controversial in itself, and there are a range of different views within Scottish Environment Link over the role wildland should have. But I think where it's positive is that it's recognising that there's a national interest in identifying that some areas are more sensitive to that type of development and some areas are less sensitive. And I think that's the type of thing which the National Planning Framework could more usefully tease out more frequently. So, for instance, aquaculture is another, the other sector which you mentioned. There are various other sectors which could also fall into this bracket. But it's something that if we recognise as a nation that it's a nationally important sector that we want to support or we want to control in a certain way, then the National Planning Framework, I think, has a role for identifying which areas are more likely to be suitable for that type of development and which areas are less likely to be suitable to that type of development. So that's not saying, for instance, in the case of wild land, that these areas definitely shouldn't have wind farms in them. It's just saying that these areas might be more sensitive to that type of development, and in some instances we might want to be more careful. So that's providing that national spatial steer. And I think onshore wind is a particularly interesting example, because what's really happened in planning policy up till now is that effectively the pressure has been put on local authorities to identify which areas are more and less sensitive. And that's good to give local authorities the responsibility to manage their own areas, but I think if it's something which is a national priority, it's something which should really be getting debated a bit more at the national level as well. So we might want to think about where things go in a national context too.
Thank you.
Right, we'll certainly develop some of these points, I suspect. Fergus Murray first.
Yes, speaking from a Gallenpute's perspective, aquaculture and wind energy, onshore wind energy, is the most hotly debated topic in our community. They're both very important for the economy of our community. I think what the difficulty, I suppose, the NPF3 has is they're really very quickly evolving industries. And just to say, for aquaculture, we're seeing there's 485 people employed in Argyll and Bute in aquaculture, and they're all largely employed in our remote communities that sustain those communities. They can always be, not always, but they're quite often very controversial. There's one in Loch Etive that's generated thousands and thousands of objections and letters of support on the other side. But I don't know if this MPF3 can actually sort of anticipate their trends, because what we're seeing now is that industry is now moving onshore into sealed kind of operations and larger scale than ever before, and also that it's actually moving offshore and actually targeting communities and having referendums in Colonsay, for example, to say whether or not they would support that industry. And the plus side of it is that they would create housing for the workers, they would create 12 jobs. And they actually had a referendum in Colonsay. They accepted it. They also had a referendum in Col, and they rejected it, and the company walked away. So it's quite a rapidly changing industry, and I don't know if we can anticipate it. The other thing with wind farms, we have accommodated 14 commercial-sized wind farms in Argyll and Bute, and I think we've done it quite well in the sense of we've worked with SNH and other partners to try and make sure that they fit with the landscape, and we've got a very high-quality landscape, as you know, in Argyll and Bute. But it's starting to get to a bit of a tipping point for some people, and whether or not the MPF3 could think about regional targets, because what we see is some people turning against an industry which has got very many good carbon benefits, but if they had some kind of idea where it would stop, then they might be more acceptable to it. And it's just an observation, and I know it's a very difficult one to do, but that's just what I wanted to make.
Graham Day.
Just following on from that point, I'd be interested in how you would define regional, and perhaps whether you would have local authorities working closely together, because there is an issue out there where perhaps on the border of two local authorities, on one side there are substantial numbers of wind farms, and on the other there's a great resistance to perhaps one appearing because it's impacting on the area that sits on the border of the two authorities. I wonder how you would tackle that. I mean, would you want to see local authorities come together in obvious groupings to form that region?
I think you would. Argyll and Bute is always difficult. Where do you actually put us? So we're actually engaging with both sides, the Central Belt authorities and also the Highland as well. But I think there is natural clusters that authorities could work together and talk about a regional target. I think it's possible.
Paula Charlson.
I was just going to touch on the issue of wind farms. In the context of what we're discussing here, of course, is about low-carbon Scotland. So, obviously, onshore wind farms are contributing significantly to the government's targets on renewables, on production. I think 100% of electricity domestic from renewables by 2020. So, it's an important development, and economically as well. SEPA at the moment, as you'll be aware, validates carbon assessments for the major wind farms, 50 megawatts and above, for Section 36 consents. And from our experience up to now, we've done a little bit of an assessment of the farms that we've assessed, and there is significant opportunity to reduce emissions by sensitive siting of these wind farms, taking account of the guidance that's out there as well, but obviously particularly thinking about the peatland, because you don't want to be disturbing peat and producing emissions, carbon emissions, while you're busy putting in a renewable energy source. So we would argue that you could strengthen that requirement in terms of back to carbon assessment by carbon assessment. Maybe it's something that would be picked up in SPP again. And there's an example, Convener, you might be interested in, that Natural Resources Wales, who use a similar carbon assessment technique that we use for the carbon validation, actually have made a commitment in guidance that when a wind farm is developed, that if there is a loss of carbon from peatland, that there's like-for-like replacement. So there's peat restoration is required either on the site, near to the site, or perhaps even offsetting elsewhere, which then, of course, reduces that payback period that you get. Sorry,
but
it's
yes,
hard,
indeed.
But
No. It overlaps.
Yep.
And then just before we do, and while we're talking about low-carbon places, re-emphasised to me last night by an active officer in Scottish Agricultural Organisation Society that promotes cooperatives, that it's absolutely essential for people to ensure community development by having a steady income. And the main steady income that people can have in communities like Gia is from their own wind energy. So why would we want to be denying people the potential to have that when it could be the only steady source of income? Of course, it may be that we'll be finding that solar's one of the things which becomes, a greater priority in some parts of the country. So it's not just from wind, it could be from hydro and all the rest of it. So, if we're talking about a low-carbon place, can we possibly, or a low-carbon business, like a farm, should we be denying people the right to make cheaper electricity in order to be a low-carbon contributor in the country? Any comments? Alec Ferguson.
I'm sure anybody is seeking to deny that, Convener, with respect. But I think, I don't think anybody, there may be some people who do that, but I don't think anybody around this table is suggesting that. Nor do I think anybody around this table would agree that you can continue with this type of development in a completely unplanned way. There has to be some restriction on development of this, and I think anybody would agree with that. Surely it is important that NPF3 looks at these issues, especially when evidence has suggested that it is not doing so in a way that could be more effective. For instance, I think I absolutely agree that there's been an increase, a very welcome increase, in local authorities producing their own guidance on, for instance, wind farm development. What gets communities' backs up, amongst other things, is when a plan is rejected on the basis of local authority guidance. The developers then appeal to the Scottish Government, and not always by all means, but sometimes that decision is overturned. So there are, I think, issues that are worthy of discussion around this table, and I don't think anybody's seeking to deny the development of renewable energy. Particularly when it particularly relates to the ongoing development and economic development of local communities.
Well, I'm talking about a low-carbon places here, which we're discussing at the moment, in Claudia's sort of estimation. We are needing to find ways to make places more resilient. You just wonder whether some local communities, in inverted commas, who take strong views about these sort of things, would have a different view if they actually controlled the resource themselves. Peter.
I was going to come back on earlier questions about supporting, examination of a more strategic approach to wind farm development, because I think we all agree that we want wind farm development to support the transition to a low carbon economy, but we want it we want to maintain it. We want to have it in the right place, and one of our challenges are that there are sensitivities out there, and we're going to come back to Pete. We want to avoid those sensitive areas and provide a steer to other areas which are more robust or resilient to this. And that has got to be one of the aspirations of MPF, to provide that certainty for developers, because I don't think we all want to get involved in sort of later in the planning system where we're very much defending the natural heritage or defending interests. We actually want to plan for development, and the National Planning Framework is a chance for us to get ahead and provide that steer on the right locations for certain development.
We've got Fergus, I think, next, and then Graham Day.
Okay, it's just, I think the planning authorities find it very difficult to distinguish between a community project and a commercial project. We from our perspective, treat them, look at the same criteria that developed through the SPP, and very much we go down that line to be fair to everyone. But usually, community ones are smaller scale, and what we tend to do as well is work very closely to communities and say that in some areas that are very sensitive through birds or whatever, onshore wind is not suitable, but there's so many other things. Mini hydro is a huge thing that we push in for communities, and solar, biomass is a big thing in Argyll and Bute, and we're looking, working with the communities to look at tidal and wave devices as they come, as the technology comes. And I think there's going to be a great future for communities. We've got 25 islands, and they're all looking at different ways of renewable energy at the moment, from the whole gambit of, and I think that's going to be a big feature coming in the years ahead.
Graham Day, and then Paula.
Thank you, Kavira. I don't want to stray off the subject in any way, but I do think that there is an issue there in regard to small-scale wind developments in Scotland, because at face value, quite often for no real rhyme nor reason, individual turbine applications being made by agricultural businesses are turned down when perhaps a few miles away in a similar setting one is granted. And we surely have to be mindful of the pressures that we place on agriculture in terms of, as a government, as a parliament, we ask for them to reduce their carbon footprint. They also have the pressures coming from the supermarket contracts they're signed up to become more green, and they want to reduce the costs of their business. And I think there is a shortfall, a deficit there in how we deal with this issue.
That's one I think we're going to return to in the next section as well. We've got Paula, who's going to make a comment here.
relevant at this point. But just coming back to what Claudia was saying about we're trying to create a low-carbon place. We've talked about wind farms as community opportunities, but I think another big opportunity that's presented in NPF is the role in delivering heat networks, which would be informed by the national heat map that's being developed. And I think there are opportunities there. It's a difficult situation for retrofitting district heating schemes, but it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity again for communities actually to invest in community district heating schemes as well. So I think something that perhaps pushes that more in NPF, that again about that designing of a place, of a sustainable place, to make sure we think about how you might use district heating. And I think we might come on to some discussion about waste, but that, you know, the use of waste heat, for example, from certain energy plants, energy waste biomass plants, for example. I think if there's more focus on that would be another opportunity.
Our aim, obviously, with your evidence is to inform us for the next panel and so on, and for the report that we make. So these things are taken on board, you know. It's not a matter of arguing it to a standstill just now, but that's absolutely understood. Can we move on to peatlands, particularly, since you seem to have got there anyway?
Thank you, Convener. I think Paula Charlson touched on this a little while ago, and obviously in the evidence we have that SEPA are seeking specific requirement in NPF 3 for onshore wind spatial guidance on the importance of avoiding deep peat areas, with all the negative consequences that can have, obviously. I'm wondering, though, how prevalent a problem this actually is. I'd also like to explore, if we can, whether in practice offsetting is taking place, and also whether, to some extent, with onshore wind development, the associated environmental assessments that are done in relation to proposed developments are actually increasing our knowledge of the condition and the nature of the peat that we have out there.
Paula, yeah?
Happy to add a little bit more to what I've said already. So you asked whether you think it is an issue. I think it will be a growing issue. I think the more you seek land for wind farms, you know, you start to more encroach into the deeper peat area. So I think there's a potential for it to be a bigger problem. Something like 50% of, peatland, the peatlands in Scotland hold 50% of the carbon that's sequestered in soils in total, and they cover about a quarter of Scotland's land, which is far more, of course, than South. So it's a significant area, so there is the potential for it to become more of an issue. You asked the question about whether offsetting is done. Now, offsetting is not required when a wind farm is for planning consent for a wind farm in Scotland at the moment. What's required is that they follow the guidelines that have been developed with ourselves, with SNH, with Scottish Government on siting of wind farms to minimise the impact on peat and minimise the carbon emissions. There's encouragement for some restoration post to the end, after the 25-year period of the wind farm licence. But no, we don't have a requirement for offsetting. There are voluntary codes. The peatland code exists at the moment. So some developers, perhaps some private organisations, do sign up to that, where they can choose to contribute to the peatland code to offset some of their carbon emissions, and that could be encouraged more. The other thing you asked about the environmental impact assessment, does it make a difference? So at the moment, there's a carbon calculator, as it's known, is used for only for wind farms that are subject to an energy consent unit consent, so that's 50 megawatts and above. I haven't got the figures to hand, but there are significantly more wind farms that are developed below that, so they aren't subject to any the carbon calculator type approach. They have to take account of the carbon impacts, I think, in the environmental impact assessment. So are they making a difference? I think from our analysis of what we've done, we can see that there is a difference. And not just from the calculator, the fact that they have to do the assessment, the whole use of the guidance that encourages better and more sensitive development, I think, has made a significant difference. And I think there's there's opportunity for more, and not just on wind farms. It's odd that we only do it for wind farms. Why are we only doing it for wind farms? Yes, they receive renewable obligations consent. There are other things that do, and we don't subject them to dissimilar scrutiny.
Continue this conversation first with Aidan.
Going through the issues in kind of a similar order, I guess. I mean, I think sort of wind farm peatland interactions, if you like, is probably becoming a bigger issue, and I think it makes sense for us to try and, in the first instance, if we can, avoid siting developments of any type on valuable peatlands. And so I think where National Planning Framework and SPP could perhaps be more useful there, again, is providing a bit more of a spatial guide. And actually, interestingly, in the main issues report, which was published by government last summer, there was a map of peatland, which has kind of unfortunately not made it through to this stage. The other spatial thing which exists at a national level actually is some national spatial guidance which SNH have produced, which identifies more sensitive areas of peatland as well. SNH actually produced this strategic locational guidance for onshore wind, which includes a range of different constraints. And all it seeks to do is to show which areas are more likely to be sensitive and which areas are less likely to be sensitive. So it acts as a flag that that's something that needs to be considered. It's not about stopping development happening in any locations. It's just saying, if you build here, this is one of the issues that might need to be considered, and it's less likely to need to be considered over there. I think it is important not to single out wind farms on this, though, because it always ends up kind of dominating the discussion in Scotland and has done for the last few years. So other sectors do cause damage to peatlands as well if they're in the wrong place, whether it's a housing development or a supermarket. Or one of the sectors I've been working on quite a lot over the last 6 months or so is open cast coal, which often has a big interaction actually with peatlands, and obviously the carbon balance of a coal mine is slightly different from the carbon balance of an onshore wind farm, and that's something which needs to be borne in mind. In terms of offsetting or kind of compensating for losses, I think most responsible onshore wind farm developers, if they're going into any area which has got peatland of any sort of biodiversity and carbon value in it, will carry out management works to try and make sure that what peatland is there is enhanced and the value of it is improved. And my organisation, RSPB Scotland, does a lot of work with the individual onshore wind farm developers to try and really deliver some positives on that. And there are a lot of success stories around Scotland in that, and that kind of relates, I suppose, to the kind of final point about whether our understanding is improving, and I think it really is very rapidly. It's improving in terms of the impacts that wind farms have, say, on peatlands, and other developments have on peatlands, and it's types of things that we need to do to restore them. So our knowledge is really improving quite rapidly on that.
Just before I bring the next person in, can I just make the observation that peat varies in depth, clearly, and it's very important that when we talk about peatlands that we recognise this and also perhaps reflect on the fact that there are unlikely to be major developments on deep peat for renewable energy. There may be developments proposed that are on shallower peat, but the offsetting thing is the thing that Aidan Smith has been talking about just now. But please remember that it varies considerably wherever proposals like that are brought in. It's an observation of mine that I've noticed on the ground, since I've got quite a lot of ground that's affected. Peter?
Yeah, Scottish Natural Heritage is leading on the restoration project, and we are developing various initiatives to try and restore peat, reflecting the importance of it. And I just wanted to emphasise that that is a project we're taking forward, but we are learning from experience. I think certainly the quality of peat does vary, and we have to reflect that. So that's a very good point to make. But I think whilst we're doing this restoration, what we don't want to do is make the problem harder than we've got at the moment. And so I think I would support the comments that have been made about trying to avoid areas that are important for carbon capture. So that, in a way, is what the National Planning Framework is trying to do, is get that balance between restoring things and actually promoting development. And that is one of the challenges, and maybe a question you want to ask us later on is whether we feel there is the balance there. So I wanted to do that. And then in terms of our strategic locational guidance, which Aidan has mentioned, that is, again, trying to help development by identifying sensitivities, whether it's peat. It isn't actually, saying no to development, but it's just identifying sensitivities that should be considered in terms of development. So it's a sensitivities mapping rather than a constraints mapping. So, sorry.
Right, and Bruce?
Covered quite a lot of what I was going to say,
Right,
but I'll maybe just add quickly on the mitigation hierarchy point. Peatlands are slightly different from other habitats in that they can't just be replaced per se, so we couldn't just take the footprint of the footplant and the wind farm and replace that with deep peat that's taken thousands of years to form. So particularly in the case of deep peat, we'd want to make sure that we first of all avoided the site if possible, and then looked at siting on the wind farm itself, on the least deep peat. I've increasingly seen, as Paula mentioned, the newer applications that are coming forward seem to be on the areas where deeper peat is placed, and I suppose that's because all the low-hanging fruit has gone, more or less, so to speak. So that's just 2 points to add to Aidan's there.
Interesting, but you know, the differentiation between whether in fact what you're saying is true would be useful to know, because if applications are being placed on deep peat, I'd be interested to know where these are, because you know, it's an implication that you're making at the moment, which I don't know whether it's borne out in reality, because we've got to differentiate between what are the depths of peat and what deep peat is, you know. Yeah. Paula first and then Aidan.
Yeah, just a short point really. As you say, Convener, the depths of peat vary, and the depths of peat vary within one site. And actually the developers do carry out quite extensive assessments of the peat depths, and micro-siting of the wind turbines makes a huge difference. So, you know, there's responsible behaviours there, and they recognise that difference for sure.
Useful, thanks for that short point. Aidan and then Fergus. Yeah.
Yeah, just a kind of similar point to what Paula was going to say there, that peat depths vary across an individual site. I mean, there certainly are at least bits of individual sites where there's peat which is quite deep, which is being affected, and there are different definitions as well of what constitutes deep peat. I think Forestry Commission's definition from memory is over 0.5 of half a metre deep, I think, starts to constitute deep peat for planting, and there are certainly development sites happening on areas where peatland is deeper than that, and there are other activities happening on those areas as well, and I definitely wouldn't particularly single out onshore wind for affecting these sites either. We've had some quite concerning open cast coal mine proposals as well recently, for instance, which have been on peat, which we would consider to be quite deep as well. So it's different sectors, different types of technology that are affecting it. And quickly, just to back up Bruce's point, I guess, as well on peatlands, that when it comes to offsetting, yeah, it's not quick to recreate peatland because it takes a few thousand years to form. So we have to bear that in mind as well.
Fergus Murray, perhaps the last point in this before our final theme.
Yeah, I just wanted to support your view, Convener, about in terms of we need more information and how it's actually affecting peat. My experience of working with wind farms, developers do everything to avoid peat because of the costs and everything else. We try and micromanage at all stages to avoid peat. And the last thing that is what the use of peat is vital for the Isla whisky industry. And they always remind us that when we take through our local development plan. So it's worth bearing in mind it's not just wind farms that affect peat. So
I'm concerned about some people who say they like whisky but not Isla whisky, if that's the reason, but they're wrong. Anyway, final point, I think, of our theme is, you know, how NPF3 supports Scotland in adapting to the impacts of climate change, so adaptation in this particular section, and how does NPF3 help us in that regard? Somebody like to kick off there? Jim wants to say something. Yes, please.
It's more just exploring within.
Yep,
yeah, but
please.
Many of the respondents regarded flood and flood management, and part of it is part of the proposals are, you know, a need for catchment scale flood risk management in response to changing weather plans. Of course, catchments of river catchments aren't necessarily all within one local authority, and Alistair Brown's already mentioned about Glasgow working with North and South Lanarkshire and effects such as perhaps quarries, as we like some of the proposal in Overburns and New Lanark in the past could have had effects that would have downstream right into the Port of Glasgow, I suppose. So I was just wondering if our guests today have any idea where we are at catchment scale sort of flood risk management. Is there any good practice actually happening, or are local authorities in particular perhaps just working in silos in some degree?
Is it on this point?
Yeah, well, first of all,
right.
Just specifically on that point, Borders land use strategy is the one that's talked about most at the moment, for and the kind of the work that the Tweed Forum does has been quite a good example of that. So that's definitely one I'd point the committee towards. Do you mind if I move on to a further point, or do you want to?
We can open it out. This is our final main theme.
Yeah. This is where I quite like to talk about the Central Scotland Green Network, and actually the fact that the National Ecological Network has not been included as a national development. First of all, on the CSGN, quite a lot of feeling and link that we support the active travel parts of that, but there's not a lot in there in the Green Network about biodiversity. Obviously key for helping species adapt our networks across the landscape, and that's something that we feel is kind of missing from the Central Scotland Green Network now. We would have liked to have seen a national ecological network to help these species move throughout the landscape and make sure that it's not just the central belt that we're concentrating in terms of biodiversity, but also in terms of adapting to things like flooding as well. It's not just central belt towns that suffer from flooding, as we know from the Borders, Aberdeenshire. So that's some quite severe problems recently. We need green infrastructure in the upper catchments, and that's something that we feel the National Ecological Network could help deliver. We've heard about money compensation from wind farms for local communities. At the moment, that's sometimes we don't know where to spend that most appropriately. We've also got constrained budgets from the SRDP at the moment. We think a National Ecological Network could help pinpoint that money and deliver more bang for our buck. We think that definitely would be a good place to include this, would be within MPF3, so it has a strategic oversight. That's something I'd like to put out to everyone.
In the kind of concept of, you know, a more complete view of what Scotland we want to see, sort of approach is what you're saying. Okay. Anyone else want to come in on those points? Fergus, first of all, then Paula, then.
It's just in relation to the flooding. In terms of it, again, we work very closely with SEPA in terms of trying to identify our flood risk again. We don't have much interaction with other local authorities in terms of flooding. Maybe it's because of our geography, but maybe there should be some more. And we do obviously converse with our colleagues in the flood sector at a professional level, but it doesn't transpose itself to cross strategies. Our issue in Argyll and Bute is largely coastal flooding. 80% of our people live on the coast, and quite vulnerable, increasingly vulnerable communities that are subject to quite regular flooding. Our concern is about the practicalities, but if we look at the funding from the government, which is is limited, there's a kind of £2 million threshold or cap in terms of if it's a scheme that's less than that, it's probably less likely to get assistance, and that's relevant for Argyll and Bute because most of our schemes are probably less than that, and so there's a concern: will we be able to address these ongoing flooding issues in the years ahead? But I think there is scope for further working together on this issue.
Paula, and then Alistair.
Okay, I was going to come in on two things, on flooding and on the point that Bruce was making about the National Ecological Network. So in flooding, obviously SEPA supports the recognition of the importance of the catchment scale to flood risk management in rural areas, but I think flooding affects rural and urban areas, and so I think we would like to see a strengthening of NPF to ensure a stronger alignment with the delivery of the sustainable flood risk management in general. Perhaps almost as a minimum to ensure that there's a prioritisation to reduce the overall flood risk within Scotland in developments, so supporting the flood risk management process. I think you could almost go as far as to say that we think to have the regard that housing and other types of development should avoid flood risk areas wherever possible, and that's perhaps not strengthened strong enough in NPF and could be complemented in the SPP. SEPA are working with partners, with Scottish Government, RTPI, heads of planning actually, in further developing flood risk management guidance through SPP to ensure that there's measures in the flood risk management strategies that are being developed now. Now we have the hazard maps, developing the strategies, and then we'll have the local authority plans to ensure that embedded in those, that we embed a flood risk activity. Sorry, what's the word? We've got the right mitigations in place, I think is what I'm trying to say, from the flood risk management strategies. So that was a flooding issue. And on the National Ecological Network, so we support the supporting of the Glasgow and Clyde Valley Green Network, Central Scotland Green Network, sorry. I think we don't say as far as that we think it should establish a national ecological network, and I think it's important that the NPF says it is aspiring to that, and hopefully then it might appear in the next national national planning framework. But I think we do have to make sure that there's concerted action to get to that place, that it could be a national development. And also in the 2020 Biodiversity Challenge, addressing that, there's also a drive within that to encourage the development, to get to a place where you can establish a national ecological network. So I think just to strengthen that would be useful.
The city perspective, Alistair Brown.
Yes, we in Glasgow we've been working closely with Adaptation Scotland on what's called Climate Ready Clyde, which doesn't get a mention in NPF 3. But again, it's another example of where, particularly for cities, and I suppose if you can forgive me, I do need to focus on Glasgow and the central belt here. The regionalisation of a lot of these issues is going to be really important. Glasgow City Council is not going to, I mean, climate change doesn't end at our city boundary, and we really have to work on a regionalised basis with other local authorities and with other partners. And the maybe discussions we've had about drainage, Climate Ready Clyde is maybe another example. You know, that regionalisation is something that I don't think comes out of the NPF 3, and if you look at the development priorities, some of them are quite geographically localised. It talks about individual parts of Scotland. It doesn't really pick up on the need for the partnership working that we talked about earlier on, and that regionalisation that would lend itself to many benefits in certainly some of the city areas. And the other area which I think we haven't really picked up on, again through NPF 3, is about the resilience planning. Resilience is going to be really important for some of the larger towns and cities. For us to be able to adapt our infrastructure and our systems so that they can deal with major climatic events in the future is going to be really important. That's not just about drainage, but it's about other networks, transport, communications, the housing developments and the various sustainable building opportunities that might be there. And if you forgive me again, if I can just maybe make one last point on behalf of Glasgow and the west of Scotland, we do really feel quite strongly that the development opportunities, the national development priorities that are being set in NPF 3, these are going to have a weight in terms of development in the future. If you're picking up on that regionalisation point, they just do not seem to give enough emphasis to the importance of the metropolitan Glasgow area in terms of the Scottish economy and in terms of the regeneration and development of Scotland over the next 20 to 30 years. And we would seek that that was addressed.
Okay, thank you for that. Peter Hutchinson and Aidan Smith.
In terms of climate change adaptation, we welcome the emphasis in the NPF 3 about green infrastructure, and we think the creation of woodland, sustainable drainage, practical things like that are very important for creating this resilient environment. So that should be welcomed. But I would like to note the comment made by Fergus Murray that we need to have sort of practical guidance out there, and I think that that's where the MPF can provide a vision or a steer, but organisations like Scottish Natural Heritage have got to provide guidance on practicalities. So I have noted that. And the other point out, in terms of the National Ecological Network, I think SNH certainly has listened to these various comments, but what we're trying to do is take forward the principles of that through the development of a green infrastructure, which is emphasised quite a lot within MPF 3.
That's fine, thank you. Aidan Smith.
Yeah, just a couple of quick points, really. I mean, the first is I think that discussion has really re-emphasised the point I've already made, which is that while the National Planning Framework is focusing on planning and built environment largely, there are these links to other land uses, particularly sometimes rural land uses, which still influence and impact on our built environment and sometimes our urban areas. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily brought out as much in the National Planning Framework as it perhaps could be. Maybe an exception to that is the Central Scotland Green Network, but even that still kind of focuses on the things which explicitly require planning permission, and I think that's a bit of a weakness in the current description of the Central Scotland Green Network. I think it could be broadened out to include other things a bit more clearly. The other kind of final observation is just that we've touched on a really broad range of things, even though the committee has obviously been keen to focus in on one sort of general area here, and certainly Scottish Environment Link have found it really hard to get information together and analyse the document in the very short time which has been available, and I think it's quite apparent to Scottish Environment Link that 60 days parliamentary scrutiny is a very short time for us to get an analysis together and put it into the various committees which are looking at it. And I do wonder whether it's perhaps not time to have another look at that and see whether 60 days is enough to cover these very broad and very important issues for the future of Scotland.
We've had several bites at this particular cherry, so I guess it wasn't new ground that we were coming to, but more honing in on particulars and so on. But these remarks are taken on board. Thank you very much, everybody. It's a suitable point, I think, to thank you all for the evidence you've given us. This will lead into us having another evidence session on the 5th of February with stakeholders on NPF 3 and developing these matters. So with that, that ends the public part of this meeting. Thank you, everybody. We will clear the gallery and we will move the meeting into private after a comfort break.